fine. It's the interface to the laptop.
I think we're good.
Okay, now we're good?
Oh, yeah.
All right. And is there a place I need to stand to
No, I'll get you.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Good, great. All right.
Hi, folks. Good afternoon. HouSecCon 6.0. Everyone having a good time? Great. So up next, Dan Cornell, principal and one of the founders of the Denim Group in San Antonio. He's also the original creator of ThreadFix. I know that we've got a team now. And Dan is still OWASP board.
OWASP San Antonio.
OWASP
chapter
San
lead.
Antonio. And pretty much one of the AppSec needs in the country. So Dan's going to talk about development tools for security pros.
All right. Thank you. Oh, am I getting feedback? Should I not stand in front of that? All right. I'll stand over here away from that. All right. Howdy, everybody. Okay, we have any kids in the audience? No. Good. My business partner, John Dixon, has given me a list of words and hand gestures I'm not allowed to make during presentations. But that's a lot to remember, so I'm gonna do my best. I just want to make sure that there weren't any kids. I've seen a couple running around here. So today I want to talk. Today's talk has both a sermon at the beginning and then a lesson at the end. Is maybe how I'd break it up. And what I want to talk about is looking at folks in the security space, some of the relationships they have with development teams, and I want to make some suggestions on some things security folks can do to improve relationships with their development teams. And then we'll look kind of particularly at some use cases of how, if you're in an organization that is starting to push toward more DevOps style of practices, that you can apply these patterns to help get security properly inserted into that transition. So as you look at your organization, you see that they're breaking down the barriers between development and operations. You can similarly look for opportunities to break down the barriers between security and development and operations. That's a picture of me that gets included in these slides for some reason. I'm not sure why. I guess what's important on this slide is I come into security from development. So I started my career in the mid to late 90s doing a lot of early server-side Java stuff. Spent the early 2000s doing some of the early ASP.NET. But really for the last decade, what I've focused on is looking at how does the software that development teams build, how does that impact the security of the organizations that go and field that software? And so I'm a software developer that has come into the world of security, and specifically application and software security, as opposed to being someone who came into security from a systems administration background or a IT audit background or something like that. Just get a show of hands. How many folks here have a development background? Okay, good. A couple folks. Other folks just more of a pure security background, pen testing, things of that nature. Excellent. Good. And so that's in addition to being a picture of the only coat I own. With my new current short haircut, the important thing to take away from this slide is that my perspective is one who spent a lot of time doing software development, but has come into the world of security. And the perspective that has given me is, has been to see a lot of the talk that goes on, kind of the internal or self-talk that security folks have, and the talk that they have toward development teams. Reflects, I think, in a lot of cases, a lack of understanding of how modern development teams work. And I think that causes a lot of trouble, especially in the area of application security, where the security folks tend to understand the risk and have a concept of that, but the developers actually have to change their behavior for security to get what they want. And these interaction patterns that get set up, I think, are not are pretty. I'll go beyond saying they're not super helpful. I'll say that they're actively harmful in a lot of cases. That's where I work. So I was giving a talk on mobile application security at B-Sides Austin in 2011. Really, fun show, fun talk. I don't know if anybody was there. That was when the fire marshal came in and shut it down. I guess the B-Sides people, or sorry, the whatever that. Not Austin City Limits. What's the other one? South by Southwest, yeah. The South by Southwest people are not like a bunch of fun hippies. Like, they actually don't want other people running events when South by Southwest is running, and so the B-Sides venue got shut down, or the upstairs got shut down by the fire marshal and whatnot. But while I was giving this talk, I'm talking about mobile application security and looking, talking about the challenges that people see in mobile security, especially with development, where a lot of mobile developers don't necessarily, a lot of developers don't have a strong background in secure coding and secure design. And when you move someone into mobile development, it's often their first project doing mobile development. So you have someone that doesn't know about security, doesn't know about mobile, and therefore they don't know about mobile security, right? And that leads to problems. And this guy sitting in the back, I remember, he says, if those developers would just stop writing such crappy, I can't read my slide, crappy code, I think is the word I'm supposed to use right here. If these developers stop writing such crappy code, all our lives would be a lot better, right? And I thought to myself, and I actually said to the guy, I was like, wow, like, I bet the one meeting you had with your development team went real well. I mean, I bet they probably have a picture of you on the dartboard in the developer break room. But it was so typical of the attitude that I've seen a lot of time from a lot of security folks. And the pen testers are like, oh, these guys are so stupid because I was able to pwn them, and these guys are stupid, and I'm so smart. And it's like, cool. And there's really like a precedent for like curmudgeons in the security industry. It's really kind of celebrated, and I understand that because security's hard. Folks aren't. You have a view of things from a risk management standpoint that is often not shared at the management or executive level, and that's I get it. But to really be effective, that's not helpful. It doesn't solve anything. So here's a Facebook post that I saw from a guy that I really respect, right? And these are instructions on how to use a Western-style toilet, right? And as a person from America who's extensively used Western-style toilets, it's easy to look at that and be like, oh, come on, like just like this guy, really? Instructions needed? Well, yeah, if you didn't grow up in the West, like Western-style toilets are not really exactly not exactly what you might expect. It's not necessarily self-evident how to use that if you're used to using non-Western toilets. And so I saw this, and I was like, really? Come on, man! Like that, it shows a lack of understanding and perspective. And to flip that around, I'll tell a story where I also have to be very careful not to use the hand motions, or else I'll be in trouble with John. But at the first OWASP summit in Portugal, there was a bunch of guys who were hanging around, and we had a free day. And somebody came to me and said, hey, are you going to Africa with us? And I said, what are you even talking about? And they said, no, we're going to rent a van, drive through Portugal, drive across Spain, and we're going to take a ferry over to Morocco, right? And I said, well, of course I'm doing that. Why wouldn't I be on that trip? And that's what we did. We went over there. So we ran around Morocco for a while, had a good time, saw some things, bought a hookah, which the airport security people love coming back in. But at some point, we were heading back to the ferry. We were going through a coffee shop, and I decided I'm going to go to the restroom. And when I walk into the restroom, I see, well, there's a urinal on the wall. It's mounted kind of tall, all right? Okay. So I stand up on my tiptoes and work to make sure I can reach the urinal. And as I'm doing this, I'm kind of teetering. And at some point, I teeter over to the right, and around the corner, I see a hole in the ground with 2 foot pads next to it. And I said, this isn't a urinal, I'm actually peeing in the sink. I could have used some instructions, right? So if I want to be like the funny guy, it's like, oh, look, this guy couldn't figure out how to use the toilet. Well, when I was using, standard across the world, when I was using that tool, I didn't understand it either. So I had to warn the guy who was coming in after me after I cleaned stuff up. I was like, by the way, that's the sink. It's not a urinal, I assure you. And so that really drove home for me. Or again, flipping it around and saying, well, who couldn't figure this stuff out? Well, hey, if I consider myself to be a pretty smart guy, and I didn't figure it out until it was too late. So, I think that a little bit of empathy is maybe going to help. Because if you go to developers, with this like crazy overzealous security attitude of like, hey, you guys are stupid, look at all the stuff you did wrong, it becomes very, very easy to ignore you, right? It becomes effortless to ignore people that come at you with that type of an attitude. And if you set yourself in opposition to the development teams, they're going to be like the honey badger. They're not going to care, right? A honey badger simply does not care if you're coming in and telling them that they're all screwed up. And again, that leads to these really bad interaction patterns that we've seen, where security has a legitimate concern. They've got stuff that they want done, but the development teams are not interested in doing it. And so, I gave a talk at RSA this year, talking about how the security industry really loves Sun Tzu metaphors for things, right? Like if you know yourself and if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you win all the battles. If you know yourself and you don't know the enemy, or whatever, you split battles. And if you don't know yourself and don't know the enemy, you're just going to get creamed all the time. And my assertion at RSA was it would be more beneficial to look at Dalai Lama quotes to inspire security teams as opposed to using Sun Tzu quotes, right? Again, true religion is kindness. Feel the essence of spiritual practice, your attitude toward others. I think it really helps to get your mind right, and understand what are the true risks of the business, right? Not just the information assets, but financial risk, strategic risk, physical risk. Understand where security or information security and application security fits into that spectrum of risks that the business actually has to care about. And you've got to understand how developers line up with those risks, right? If you're looking at things like financial and strategic risk, hey, if we fail to come out with new products, right? If our competitors are able to out-innovate us, that is probably a greater risk to the organization than a bad password policy, depending on what the outcomes and the impacts are. And so this is an area where I think that it's important for security to understand where they fit in the spectrum of things that can possibly go wrong to the business. But really, especially when it comes to application security, to strive to have a level of empathy for what those teams are doing. How much do you really know about what developers in your organization are doing? Okay, a number of folks had their hands up, said they came from development background. You all probably have a pretty good idea of a lot of this stuff. But what we found is a lot of folks that come into security from different, or the more traditional route. People that come into security come as sysadmins, maybe IT auditors, something like that. I gave a talk at an ISSA meeting once. I can't remember where it was, but I asked how many folks are developers, and a lot of people raised their hand. I said, how many people have ever developed in something newer than COBOL and Fortran? And all the hands went down, right? There was just not a lot of experience with people that were used to doing development in modern, web-centric, Java, .NET. PHP, Python, Perl, all the languages and the development practices that go along with how most organizations, where the bulk of new software is being developed today. And so, it's really a question that you need to ask of what are your developers actually doing? How are they working? What does their day look like? What does their tool set look like? How are they rewarded? Why do they do things in those particular ways, right? And sometimes developers are making good decisions. Sometimes maybe they're not making good decisions, but they're always making decisions for a reason. And so it's important to understand from developers what they're up to and what they're doing. And the real question is, how can you support developers, or how can you get integrated with what the developers are doing in a way that advances your goals, right? If the Dalai Lama is a little too pacifist for your taste, maybe you want to think of yourself as a Green Beret, right? The Army Special Forces, in addition to being good at kicking in doors and shooting people, the real mission of the Special Forces is to go in and wage unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense. Their goal is, let's send 12 of these guys in, and they'll make 144 folks that can fight on our side. And to do that, they get language training, weapons training, enemy weapons training, all these things. And so you can ship a handful of those folks into Afghanistan. They can link up with the Northern Alliance and knock down the Taliban in a record amount of time. Right? If you look at the way that security teams are set up in organizations, with the data coming out of the BSIM, your best case scenario, if you're looking from a software security standpoint, you've got one security analyst trying to stem the tide of 100 developers in the code that they're writing, right? That's leading organizations are going to have a 1-to-100 ratio of app security people to app development people, right? You're outmanned. Bad news, right? You're never going to have enough people to do the entire job yourself. Similarly, in a lot of cases, you're outgunned, right? If I'm looking at a request, if I'm an executive, I got 2 requests coming to me. One of them says, hey, like, I need to work on these features that a hotshot VP promised to an important customer. Like, this is what we need to be doing to create value for our business. And I've got someone else saying, like, well, no, I really want you to go and fix a bunch of these security bugs. Let's push the release back. Yeah, if I'm an executive that wants to keep his job, what decision am I going to make? I'm going to say, oh, hotshot VP, important customer, revenue. Like, yeah, something definitely good will happen over here. Something bad may happen over here. And so by realizing that you're outmanned, realizing you're outgunned, and shifting your attitude around to say, how can I get these people to help me accomplish my goals while they think they are accomplishing their goals or actually are accomplishing their goals? Any questions so far? That's the end of the sermon portion of the of this. Huh?
Are you familiar with the book, The Phoenix Project?
I am familiar with the book, The Phoenix Project.
You're preaching.
Exactly. Like, and
has anybody else read that book? Because that's pretty. It's an updated version of a book called The Goal about theory of constraints, but it's turned into the IT throughput thing. And then there's this executive that preaches about security, and they ignore him. And all that.
Yeah, no, it's a very good. I mean, it's not a bad novel. I mean, if you're reading books on planes, for being a novel about an IT project, it's really good. so I'd certainly recommend that. I haven't read it. It was what was the Goldrat's book? It was the Goal. The Goal. Yeah, also supposed to be great. I've never read that one, but I have read the Phoenix Project. Yeah, but yeah, as far as IT novel or IT project novels go, it's fantastic, right? Very much so. Looking at, like, how do we break down these silos that get created? And again, DevOps is really the focus. Is how do we break the silo between Dev and Ops? SecDevOps or DevSecOps or whatever, rugged. I don't know what it's called these days, but like that's looking at saying, well, if we're breaking down these two silos, what do we also need to do to break these down as well? So what I want to talk about through the rest of this is looking at how can you learn about, or what do you need to know about development tools, and what is that knowledge what benefit is that knowledge going to confer on you? So we're going to look at how do developers track their workload, right? If I'm a developer and I come into work, how do I know what I need to do today? How do I know what I'm going to need to do this week? Where do developers spend their time, right? If I look at a workday for a developer, assuming they're not dragged into meetings constantly, like where's that when that developer's getting work done, what tools or where is that developer working? I also want to look at automation and orchestration. That's been the big change over the past decade or so. Is a real and it's not that there's necessarily anything new, but a much more widespread use of automation and orchestration for testing. Also look at how do development teams do testing, unit testing, acceptance test, and also looking at how development teams track metrics. And so by understanding how developers are going through these processes, by understanding how developers use these tools to accomplish their goals, that puts you in a position where you can start to further your own interests in a way that you probably wouldn't be able to, because you're not going to come in and have a mandate where you can say thou shalt do this, and also I shall do that. Nah, I shall actually go talk to my manager, and my manager shall talk to his manager, who shall come and tell you to go away. And and I'll talk about some anti-patterns that we've seen in certain organizations that that really kind of get everybody bound up. So you end up with security being frustrated, insecure software being developed and deployed, and generally not a good situation. I'm going to talk through a number of different examples, and a bunch of them are going to center around this open source project ThreadFix that I started and that we run. Some of the examples won't. All the stuff that I'm talking about is all again open source community edition. You go to GitHub and pull this down. And a lot of the integrations or interactions that I talk about, you can do through ThreadFix and some of the components associated with that. But also something to look at is a lot of the security vendors that are building app security tools have similar capabilities, kind of specific to that vendor. And so that's something to look into. What does ThreadFix let you do? It lets you, create a consolidated view of your apps and vulnerabilities, lay out an application portfolio, load in the results of all the testing. So if you're doing AppScan, you're doing Fortify, you're doing Arachni, you're doing Zap or Burp, all these different testing activities that you're doing, it lets you load those into one place. Having all that data in one place, you can slice and dice it and make decisions about it. And what's really important for the purpose of what we're talking about today is it lets you take this vulnerability data, which is what security people care about, and to start to translate that data into the tools and systems that the development teams are using. And that's a critical change or a critical inflection point that we've seen in working with a number of different organizations, whether that's via ThreadFix or whether that's via some other means. When you start to characterize vulnerabilities, which is what security teams care about, when you start to characterize vulnerabilities in the tools or in the processes that development teams are using, it puts you in a much better position to start making headway because you're taking friction out of the process. You're making it easier for the developers to do what you want them to do.
Is that what they mean by virtual?
Yeah, so one of the capabilities it has is virtual patching. We won't talk a lot about that just because what a virtual patch is taking, if I know in my web application I have a cross-site scripting vulnerability in the login.jsp page for the username parameter, what I can do is take that knowledge and go to and write a rule where I can go to Imperva or Mod Security or Snort or whatever and say, whatever model you have for blocking, be very careful about blocking, cross-site scripting or SQL, whatever I said it was. Be very careful about blocking SQL injection for this URL for this parameter. And so that's more of security communicating with operations, either security operations or application operations, whoever owns the web application firewall deployment. So that's a thing that ThreadFix can do. We're going to be more talking about saying, like, how do we get this vulnerability data into the tools that developers are using? They're looking at the IDEs and the defect tracking systems and things like that.
So why is it called a virtual patch?
You're not actually fixing the code. You're using a mitigating control in the network layer before it gets to your application.
There you go. Yeah. So you're not changing the software.
It does something, but it's not fixing it.
Yeah, you're not fixing the underlying problem. Depending on the system, I look at it as providing some air cover for the development team while they actually make a fix in legacy applications. Exactly. Well, or without going through software change management. Yeah. Change management everywhere. It's which gate you want to try to get through. Yeah. So just again some background on this, more for the slides that are up. What ThreadFix lets you do, I'll just run through a really quick demo on the security side. So this is looking at what security teams are doing with whatever tools they're using. Let me see. So what you can do here is lay out, here's all the different teams that we have developing software, and here's the various applications that we have. And what you do is you upload, if you're doing, again,
when you say your company, or all of ThreadFix?
This is what ThreadFix, all the stuff that we're looking at here is all the open source stuff, yeah. And so you upload the results of whatever security testing you're doing, Fortify, AppScan, whatever, and it gives you a list of all the vulnerabilities there. And it lets you track them over time and things like that. But the kind of important thing about the situation is that you've done testing and you've got vulnerability data that that you're going to be managing in this system or in some other system. Again, you can however you're gathering and keeping track of vulnerabilities, that gets loaded in one place. Again, you can track additional stuff. Load it up. Again, you can manually upload files. And what becomes important as we start to talk about integration, at least in this case, is you've got things like a REST API, a command line client that lets you, if you've got automation around some testing, or if you can start to build automation around testing, you can create situations where this data automatically feeds into this model. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Jenkins plugin, looking at how do we get even deeper into the tools that development teams are using. So ThreadFix, again, loads all this data and gives you a consolidated view by merging and deduping this data all into one place. There we go. So posit, if you will, that we've done a bunch of scanning, loaded those all into one place, and what we've got is a set of vulnerabilities. So this is what security cares about, right? Hey, we've done a test, we've done a pen test, we've got findings, we've got this list of bad stuff that exists in our code that we want to get rid of. So at that point, you can look at saying, how do we start to make these vulnerabilities go from being vulnerabilities, which are security's problem, to being other things that are developers' problems?
All security vulnerabilities are treated as bugs.
Exactly, right? And so, how do developers manage their workloads, right? A lot of security teams that I see for some reason, seem to think that developers manage their workload using 300-page PDFs that are printed out, right? It's weird, and maybe it's because security teams speak PDF, but developers don't. And actually, we saw this interaction. We've seen it in a number of places, but I saw it very specifically in one organization. That was the inspiration for creating ThreadFix originally. But this organization's using AppScan or something to do their deep dive web application scanning. Ran a scan, got a 300-page PDF report, the color graph on the front page. Walked into the dev team manager and said, "You guys must be really bad at making secure software because I found all this stuff. You guys are pretty dumb. Here you go." And the dev team lead's like, "All right, well, what do we need to fix?" Like, fix all of it. Well, how do we fix it? I think that's mentioned in the report. I put sticky notes on the stuff I thought was really bad, right? Yeah.
Is that the only export program?
No, you can export things like XML that can be fed into different systems and whatnot. but that's what they chose. They had a lot of options, and they picked PDF, right? And so the development team goes back and grumbles, and well, this group's also doing web perimeter scanning with Qualys WAS or something. All right, so they run that, generate a 225-page PDF with a different color graph on the front page. Go back to the dev team manager. They're like, "Well, you guys, hey, we found this stuff too." And the dev team says, "Well, okay, well, is this different stuff than the original report?" And they're like, "I don't know." Yeah, they got the two-shoulder salute is what we call it around the office. Right? And so the dev team went up to their management and said, "Hey, the security dude came around and he is actively wasting my time now." Right? I thought I was on a hidden camera show because this is such a preposterous request that I'm going to go through all this data when I've got deadlines and things. And so the mandate came down hey, security, you've got to give them one list of things that they need to work on. All right, you can't give them all these multiple lists like the development team. Yeah. So what they did is they took a very expensive security analyst and started cutting and pasting data in Excel to try and line the stuff up. Right. Arguably, also not a great solution to the problem. And I've got a little hint. Just like developers don't speak PDF, they don't speak Excel either. Right? Developers don't they don't use Excel to track their what they're doing, and it's kind of like I don't know, when folks go home to see relatives and stuff, and they're like, "Oh, hey, I need you to fix my Microsoft Word. I need you to help fix my computer." I'm like, "What exactly do you think I do for a living?" Right? Tell me what you think I do, because it's not fixing it's not fixing people's Microsoft Word. That is not what I do. I don't actually know how any of these things work anymore. Right? So how do developers manage their workload? And developers actually manage their workload using defect tracking systems or change tracking systems, right? They're using things like Jira, they're using things like Bugzilla. That's where their work lives. And if you want developers to start fixing vulnerabilities, you need to make vulnerabilities live in these systems. And they're not vulnerabilities, they're software change requests, they're software bugs. And if you can start to make that transition, then the work you want them to do lives in the system where they get their work from, and it lives alongside all the other stuff that they need to do. And so, in addition to using the tools that that they're already using, they can use the processes they already use. If they're doing scrums or they're doing sprint planning, it's, hey, okay, well, for this sprint, you're going to fix this chunk of 20 cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and you're going to build this new feature that somebody asked for, right? That puts security in the same place as all the other stuff that they're doing, right? The worst interaction pattern that we've seen has been, again, here's your PDF, here's your Excel spreadsheet. The second worst is, hey, we've got a security vulnerability management system over here that you need to log into, right? So, hey, developers, go learn this thing over here. You already learned how to use Jira, which is tricky enough in some places. But now learn how to log into XYZ server to see the stuff you need to do. That doesn't work. If you want to take friction out of the process, you need to push this stuff over into the tools that developers are already using. And for workload management, that's change tracking. How do you do that? There's no hard and fast way to do that. If you do a scan with 500 cross-site scriptings, a one-to-one mapping is probably not good. Right? Hey, we got a scan with 500 cross-site scriptings. Now we've made 500 bugs in your bug tracking system. You'll get murdered in the parking lot by the quality manager person, right? It's they will be waiting in the tall grass, not good, right? So you look to cluster things. Well, hey, we've got a bunch of cross-site scriptings. Let's bundle those in packages of 20 or 25. Hand those off to the developer because that's a bite-sized chunk of work that they can do, right? So they can work their way through this stuff. Maybe you cluster by the who owns the code, right? Hey, Joe wrote all the login code, and so we're going to take everything in the login process that's a problem. We're going to give it to that person because every time anybody else touches the code, it breaks.
Obviously, when he broke it last time, he'll be the right person.
Exactly, he's the right. This guy's an expert at breaking and unbreaking the code that they've written, right? And so what, again, like this is something where typically it's a great opportunity for the security representative to sit down with the representative from the development team, whether that's the security lead, if your dev teams have security leads, whether it's the lead developer, kind of depends on how organizations set up their development teams. Great opportunity to sit down either virtually or in person and say, let's have a negotiation. Like, here's all the stuff that we found. We've cleaned out the false positives. We've got actual things that are risks. Let's talk about what stuff we're going to be able to like move around here, right? Like, hey, I really need, for SQL injection stuff, we really need to get this stuff fixed because that's going to get the PCI auditor all over me. This other stuff, maybe we can put behind a WAF for a while, But it's an opportunity to interact with the development team in a negotiating type way and to say, like, what information are your developers going to need to make it as easy as possible to fix this stuff, right? How can I take what I've got available, which is all this data about vulnerabilities, some with line numbers, some not with line numbers, potentially. How do I take this information? What's going to be the best way to present it to your developers so that they can, as efficiently as possible, chew through the stuff that they agree that that they're going to do?
Quick question for clustering and prioritization. Have you thought or seen anyone that's tried to put a dollar value or an ROI value on certain vulnerabilities so that it's weighed approximately the same value as this new feature enhancement?
I mean, that's tricky, just because, like, I don't think that we've got good from an actuarial standpoint. Right. And that's like an exercise I do in like a lot of training class stuff.
If we were to say if by all critical vulnerabilities are at this value, all highs are at that value, all mediums are at that value, it at least gives you a ballpark.
The unit that I've found that is not even a unit. Like the challenge again is like, okay, hey, well, critical is it whatever? Like, how do you know that it's going to cost us $100 to keep this vulnerability around? Right. That's really challenging because the actuarial data isn't there. We've seen that more in the negotiation of policies. Hey, criticals have to be fixed within 14 days, highs within whatever. Again, depending on if this has a compliance impact. It also depends on the industry. If you're in like a heavily regulated industry, then you've got auditors that come in and give you a little bit extra oomph on those types of demands versus if you're in. With days, weeks. I mean, it's depends on the industry. If you're in paper manufacturing, maybe it's years. I don't know. It just kind of depends on the on the organization, on the regulatory framework around that, and on the level of executive support that you have, and again on some negotiation between and that's where relationships also help. Right? If you've got a relationship with the dev teams, you can come with credibility and say like, hey guys, this is really bad. Let's talk about when we're going to get this fixed, and again, we've seen people have more success if you've got those relationships in place. It goes back to being able to speak the language of the developers.
Once you build up that trust relationship, what are examples of some carrots? Since obviously security usually uses the stick,
right?
But do you negotiate with exceptions? Do you use some of the things for carrots?
Sometimes with exceptions. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we've seen from a carrot standpoint is saying like, hey, we're going to get this data in your system. As we'll talk about, hey, we're going to push this data into your IDEs to reduce the time it's going to take. We've also seen success with saying like, hey, we've got these secure coding libraries that we've approved, and if you start to adopt these, you're going to see less of us. Unless security has a budget to like throw pizza parties or something for the development teams, which is maybe not unheard of, but it's like really what we've seen is like, how do we make this as inexpensive for the developers as possible, so that with the like budget, the tolerance that they have for budget of like being annoyed or pulled off task, that they that you're able to get the most remediation for that like virtual budget of like hassle that they're willing to put up with. And so, so one of the things that you can do with ThreadFix and a lot of the other vendor tools that support this is to integrate these as defects, to bundle these things together and to push them into defect tracking systems. And so that's something, again, whether it's through ThreadFix, whether it's through other vendors' tools, we even see people do a lot of like manual cut and pasting, which I would argue is like less than ideal, but is better than nothing. You've got to get this data into the defect tracking systems so that it lives alongside all the other work that they've got to do. If you want people to work on it, put it in the systems that they use to manage their to-do lists. Where do developers actually spend their time? /. World of Warcraft, sleeping, next to caffeine. I don't know. Like just a funny story. We had developers are kind of a different breed. And I can say that because I am one. We had a fellow coming through the office recently who runs like a civil engineering company. He's a well-established company. He's an older guy, really well-established gentleman, like an old-school businessman, like very involved in the San Antonio community. And he was walking with one of my business partners, and they walked by one of our developers' offices where the developer has swords hanging in his office because he likes like Lord of the Rings and whatever. So he has the replica swords hanging on the wall of his office. And this guy in his suit, it was already, I think, off kilter because this is the nicest I look at the office. I'm usually in shorts and a t-shirt, and everybody else is pretty much like that as well. And he walks by and he's like, "Are those swords in that guy's office?" And John's like, "Shh, keep walking, keep walking. Let's just keep on moving." I love developers. Those swords. Where do developers actually spend their time? They spend it in their IDEs, and so like that's where they're sitting to do work, right? That's where they get warning messages when they write code of stuff they need to fix. And so if you can push the data about vulnerabilities into these IDEs, that makes it even easier for the developers to fix this stuff, right? Again, taking friction out of the process. If I want somebody to fix a cross-site scripting vulnerability, if I tell them the URL and the parameter, that's kind of helpful, right? Because I at least know, and the developer can think like, oh, okay, where is this request going to go, and how do I map that in? But it's really helpful if you can point them at the line of code and say, hey, here's where the bad data came into the application, right? This is where you need, this might not be where you need to like apply the fix, but this is where you need to start tracking the code. And especially with, things like, the Java Spring, frameworks like that, where there is potentially a huge disconnect between the URL that the request came in from and the code that actually gets executed, the ability to map through and say, well, here's where you actually need to look is, can be a tremendous time saver for developers. And so one of the things that we've done is built plugins for Eclipse and IntelliJ. And we're currently working on the VisualStudio.net as well, but that can take data, load it in, and pinpoint it at the actual line of, pinpoint at the actual lines of code. And again, if you look at your vendors, a lot of the static analysis vendors have this. They've got great plugins that'll let you run scans, let you map data. Like this is technology you really need to look at. You don't necessarily need to make every developer an expert in static analysis, but giving them the ability to say, hey, here's what the control flow looks like. Let's click through that, and then we'll find where we need to actually change code. Right? So if you understand how the developers, like what IDE the developers are using, you can figure out, do we have plugins, do we have plugins that will let us help push this data into the system? One of the interesting things that we can do, and I mentioned this just because the technology is cool, is we've worked with the Department of Homeland Security to build what we call hybrid analysis mapping, where we can map dynamic vulnerabilities back to line of source code. And so what that lets us do is if you've done like a dynamic scan with an app scan standard, you can take those results, or like a burp, you can take those results and find the entry point line of code that you can then see in the IDEs, which I don't think any of the other dynamic scanner folks do that. We can do that with that technology, but like the static scanner folks, again, most of them have great IDE plugins that developers can use to help reduce the time it takes to figure out like where in the code do I need to start looking to fix this stuff. Again, understand the tools they're using and push for that, where you get these little markers and say, oh, here's where this ID comes in that you need to pay attention to.
This is for fixing a bug.
That's correct.
Maybe it's just a wild idea, but can't these scanners be in the continuous integration and it doesn't go in?
That's
your next
the next thing we're talking about. You're a pioneer. You're a pioneer in this audience. No, exactly right.
The developers really hate you. They get stuck in there. They can't check in until they fix it.
Well, it comes down to a question of like, how easy, like, what's the pain associated with getting it started, and what's the pain associated with once it's up and running. Somebody have a question in the back? Yeah, okay, good. All right, how do developers know their software works? Prayer is the technique I used most frequently. Guessing, also not bad, or really just don't care. Like the thing I just checked in worked. I'm not entirely sure about the rest of these. All right. Well, how do developers actually know their software works? They use tools like JUnit to test at a unit level if their code is doing what it's supposed to do. They use tools like Selenium from a behavior standpoint to see if the code or if the system as a whole is behaving the way that it's supposed to. And they use systems like Jenkins to run continuous integration to say, hey, when a certain event happens, when somebody checks something in, or once a day or once a week, I want to run certain tasks to verify that this build is still behaving the way that I want it to. And so if you start to look at the way teams are using these things, you can start to understand and see, if you're already doing testing, how can I incrementally add security testing to that battery of tests that's being used there? So developers in QA probably already running the tools, hopefully, embrace what they're doing and expand to include security, right? And what this does, exactly as you mentioned, it's going to reduce your mean time to identify, right? What's the lag time between when somebody introduces a vulnerability to the code base and when you find it out, right? Is it going to be once every quarter when you run your audit scan, right? That's not great. Like I can't remember what I was doing like yesterday. I'm probably not going to jump back into code I wrote 3 months ago and be real fast at fixing that stuff, right? But if you can reduce that time to identification, you can also reduce the level of effort and the mean time to fix. Even in certain environments saying, hey, we've baselined our vulnerability count, we're not going to let you introduce new criticals and highs, right? We're going to fail the build and not allow your check-in, until you can actually address this stuff. And that's something where, again, that we've built with Thread. Actually, we didn't build it. One of the community members built it and contributed to the project, which is great. But a lot of the security vendors are also starting to look at, like, how do we include our tools in the testing, and how do we use things like plugins for Jenkins, which are the continuous integration servers that developers are using. How can we use tools like that to help get our tool wired into the build? Again, the benefit of the vendor is it makes them a little stickier because they're like wedged in the process. Great. The incentive for security is that they get those things introduced. With much faster testing, the incentive for development is, hey, if you're gonna get hit with these security vulnerabilities eventually, you might as well find those out as part of the process along the way.
And also, the scanners can't pick up all these things, but the humans get better at detecting what the scanner would catch, plus all the things they fill in the gaps that are not detectable, and they just produce better code.
Exactly, and there's certain classes of vulnerabilities that scanners can't find, and I don't think are ever going to be able to find. But if you can say the base level, like our table stakes for having a check-in is that it's going to be free of kind of the standard SQL injection, cross-site scripting, things like that. If you can set that baseline, that really reduce your exposure from the stuff that people are going to find in an automated way, and if you've been efficient with this, it frees up the time of your analysts to focus on these higher value activities like doing manual testing.
There will always be certain things that you can't test from technology because they're more process or people related.
Exactly. Another thing that you can do, and I've got two different examples of this, of places I've seen folks doing this, you can use things like the Selenium test to help inform your testing. If you're using a web-based scanner, like a Burp or a Zap or a App Scanner or something like that, what you can do is say, I'm going to use your acceptance tests. So they're going to go through and crawl through the entire application, right? So your functional tests probably know about most or all of the application. If you've got good test coverage, the developers have good test coverage, you can look at saying, well, we're going to proxy all this traffic through our scanner, and that's going to teach our scanner about what the application looks like and what functionality might be there to be explored and worked with. Right? And so, again, this is a slide. I've got links. This will all be online, but the Rapid7 NTO folks have been doing that with their scan engine. The BDD security guys out of Spain, I think, have examples of that with, I think, OWASP Zap and Burp. On the open source side of things with Zap, like really interesting way to say, hey, development team, if you'll give me access to this stuff, that's going to help me make my testing better. Really cool, a great opportunity for organizations to collaborate. Then we look at SecDevOps, like, okay, how do we get all this stuff fed together? And I'm running low on time, so don't have time to drill into this, but you can see really cool stuff that the folks like at Pearson are doing the folks at Samsung are doing, the folks at Ally Financial are doing, where they're putting a lot of automation. They've got all these DevOps practices that they're adopting, and they're incorporating security testing into those. And so as they really push for this automation, this tight turnaround, and this automatic verification that puts them in a situation to push builds more quickly, they're also incorporating security testing into that. And I think that's fantastic, right? A lot of people, like the kind of the traditional security mindset, is really scared about the speed at which DevOps moves. I actually think that as you see these changes happening, kind of like musical chairs, like everybody gets up and dances around and like everybody gets a new chair. Right, this is a shuffling time where security gets a chance to find a new chair where they've got a better perspective and they can get better included. It's certainly not the time to be the person that doesn't get a chair when the music stops. Finally, looking at how do developers track metrics, and this is a really interesting thing that I learned. Again, we do both secure development and security testing services. And I'd spent a lot of my time not focused on the development side of the business. And so I looked up one day and somebody's talking about SonarQube. Anybody here heard of Sonar or SonarQube? All right, yeah. Oh, one person, right. I hadn't either, right? So I hadn't been keeping up with the development trends as much as I should. What we found is that was something that our teams were using to give them an idea of the quality of their software and of the backlog that they had. And that's mostly from a quality standpoint. And so what we've looked at doing is saying, let's start to push this security data in there along with the quality backlog. And we actually know of one organization that we're working with right now where their security team gets their security reporting through the SonarQube development backlog tracking, right? So they're instead of having a security console, all the vulnerability data gets sent up through the developers console, and the security teams consume that data from the developers tools. And that's, hopefully as this moves forward, that's going to put them in a position to really interact or have very tight interactions with the development teams. So what? Don't be a jerk. Empathize. You got to remember that you're outnumbered and you're outgunned. Be like the Dalai Lama or a Green Beret, which is maybe a better Halloween costume. Depending on what you want, but get to know the developers, the tools, and the processes. You've got to understand how they think, what they're doing, because that lets you get in and start to influence their behavior to your benefit. Look for opportunities to influence the conversation, and how can you use the tools that they're using to further your goals. You want to frame what you want. Fix vulnerabilities, write secure code in their terms, and characterized against the tool sets that they're using. And again, I love ThreadFix because I was the original author, but check, either look at our stuff or check with the security vendors. Find out what options you have for integrating with integrating security tools into the dev lifecycle, because that's a great way to, again, reduce the cost of getting these vulnerabilities fixed, reduce the time to fix. The closer you can get to development, the more you can push these tasks out to the edge of the different teams that are developing software, the more successful you're going to be, because you're dealing with, at best, that 1 to 100 ratio between folks on the app security team and developers that are out there writing software. There we go. And I think we're certainly out of time. I don't know if we're out of time for questions or when they. Okay, before the keynote starts. Okay, yeah. So we've got.
I would say you got about 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So any questions? Yeah.
Comment. I've been around long enough. I came up from the compliance and risk management side, as well as the security side, and then I inherited a system, Archer GRC in this case, and I became the system owner and developer and administrator and everything else, which means I lived long enough to experience and suffer through my own bureaucracy, and that's a very humbling experience. So walking a mile in their shoes, or even spending a day in the shoes of the developer mindset, is, as long as you're not hypocritical.
Right. No, it's that's really the, again, like this sounds to me like, I don't know why it has to be said, but I see it. I even see it in myself, like, God, these guys are so stupid. Why do they do the SQL injection? It's like, well, here's why they did it, because nobody told them not to do it, and that was something they were focused on, and they had something to get out by a deadline, right? And so if you understand that, and you're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, nobody ever trained these folks, right? And even if we trained them, like, management's not giving them time to enact these types of changes. Like, oh, okay, well, now I understand why the software that we're building, has, I was going to say is crap. It's not crap. It has challenges from a security standpoint, because you haven't put the, because we haven't put the incentive structure in place, and yeah. we haven't put the incentives in place. We haven't given these folks the what they need in order to have successful outcomes. So, any other questions? That's all good. Thank you all very much. I'll be yeah.
I have a comment. There's a book that I recommend to all developers. Purple book. We call it the Purple book. It's Secure Coding in C and C++. And it's actually put out, I think, by US Cert. And it breaks down all vulnerability classes that are found in code, categorizes them, explains why they are the way they are, and the consequences, and why you shouldn't do this. And I've got a lot of developers who really understand that. But I know it doesn't really conform to what your message was, and your message is dead on. I like it. I like it a lot. It's dead on. But that's just an extra little technique that I found. In addition to trying to talk their language, it's like, okay, now talk my language, please.
Right.
Do this.
Yeah. And to understand, like, hey, here's the implications, because it's a challenge to see, like, until you've seen an exploit, it's hard to really get why, like, oh, well, that's how SQL injection happens. Oh, well, like, why would somebody put an apostrophe in the query? Like, right, yeah, no, and that's why I think, like, organizations like OWASP are great. I mean, different chapters kind of have, like, different balances, but that interplay between the developers and the security folks, that creates the interaction that you want. Like I was in Oklahoma City, and this has been 7 years ago now or something, with Microsoft doing a roundtable for a bunch of CISOs in Oklahoma City, and I was talking to one group, and they had like some really advanced practices that hey, we have our security architects, but they spend they spend like tours or time over with the development teams and all this, and I was like, you guys are doing some really impressive stuff. Like, how did you come to this? And they're like, oh, well, risk management and protecting customer data is important to us, blah, blah, blah. And we ride, me and the head of development ride 50 miles on our bikes every weekend, right? I mean, these guys are like buddies, and so as a result, had created a working relationship where the security folks could go where they want. So I don't necessarily know that you got to dedicate your Sundays to riding bikes with representatives from the development team, but to understand that by having those relationships, that puts you in a position to better influence, and by understanding and being able to speak the language and speak to the tool sets that the development teams are using, that gives you a level of credibility that you don't have if you're the person lobbing 300-page PDFs over and saying tell me when you're done. So, we're good.
Good job.
No, thanks everybody.